It began as a hushed conversation behind Kensington Palace walls, one that aides tried to downplay, and courtiers quickly silenced. But the look on Catherine, Princess of Wales's face as she exited that private meeting said everything the palace couldn't. Something was wrong. And it involved Charlotte. What was first dismissed as a rumor soon turned into a royal firestorm, now confirmed by the very people who fought to protect it. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Inside that room, where even whispers are carefully measured, something shifted quietly, but with consequences that would ripple far beyond those guarded walls. Prince William had summoned not just Catherine, but a tightly controlled circle of senior palace strategists, individuals known less for conversation and more for execution. The meeting itself was never meant to surface. Staff movements were restricted, communication lines shortened, and those present were reportedly instructed firmly not to speak. Yet silence, in a place built on tradition and observation, often speaks the loudest. And this silence was different. It carried weight. It carried urgency. What emerged from that closed-door discussion was not a single issue, but something far more complex, a sudden restructuring proposal tied directly to the future of royal operations. It wasn't framed as optional. It wasn't introduced gently. It arrived with the kind of intensity that forces decisions before emotions can catch up. Catherine's reaction, subtle yet unmistakable, became the first visible crack in the carefully polished surface. Observers noted the way she moved afterward, composed, but not untouched. Controlled, yet carrying something heavier beneath it. William, usually measured in both tone and presence, was later seen in what insiders describe as a tense exchange with senior aides. No raised voices, no dramatic gestures, just the kind of firm, unyielding conversation that signals lines are being drawn. And perhaps more telling than what was said was who was suddenly being mentioned. Because as whispers began to circulate, one detail refused to stay buried outside. Family members were somehow connected to what had just unfolded. Unexpected names. Unlikely involvement. The kind that doesn't just complicate a situation, it transforms it entirely. Those watching closely began to notice patterns. Subtle shifts in schedules. Unexplained delays. Conversations that stopped the moment someone else entered the room. Media insiders, who had sensed for weeks that something was quietly building, now found themselves chasing fragments of a story that no one wanted fully told. And yet, piece by piece, it began to take shape not as a simple internal adjustment, but as something far more disruptive, something that threatened to redraw roles that had long been considered untouchable. And through it all, one question lingered, unspoken but impossible to ignore if this was only the beginning. What exactly had been set into motion behind those palace doors? Because whatever had shaken Catherine in that moment, whatever had pushed William into action, it was no longer contained. It was moving, expanding, pulling others into its orbit. And just beneath the surface, something far older than any current crisis was beginning to stir again, something tied not to the present, but to a legacy that refused to remain hidden any longer. But the chilling truth wasn't just about Charlotte's health, it was tied to a royal legacy that had long been buried. Until now. No one expected them to speak. Not now, not like this. But when Zara Tindall and Mike Tindall publicly aligned themselves with William's restructuring plan, the silence inside palace walls shattered, and the balance of royal power shifted in an instant. For years, they had existed on the edges of royal tension, never fully stepping into the center of conflict, never allowing themselves to be pulled into the undercurrents that so often define life within the monarchy. Their position had always been clear, supportive, present, but carefully neutral. And that neutrality had become their strength. It allowed them to move freely, to observe without consequence, to remain untouched by the quiet rivalries that shaped the institution from within. Which is why this moment felt so different. So deliberate, because when individuals who have mastered silence choose to speak, it is rarely accidental. Their endorsement of Prince William's internal decisions did not arrive wrapped in emotion or impulse. It carried the weight of calculation. Insiders, those who had watched the situation unfold long before it reached public awareness, began to suggest that this was not a sudden act of loyalty, but the result of something far more measured. Conversations that had taken place quietly. Observations made over time. A growing understanding that the structure of the monarchy was shifting and that standing still was no longer an option. What made their involvement even more significant was what it implied beneath the surface. Because Zara and Mike were never seen as political players within the royal framework. They were trusted, respected, but not strategic. And yet, here they were, stepping forward at a moment when every move carried consequence. Their decision didn't just support William, it validated him. It gave his restructuring plan something it had been quietly lacking: visible reinforcement from within the family itself. And that changed everything. Almost immediately, the ripple effects began. Conversations inside palace corridors grew sharper, more guarded. Those who had remained undecided suddenly found themselves under pressure not from public scrutiny, but from the shifting weight of internal alliances. Because if Zara and Mike had chosen a side, it raised an unavoidable question: who else already had? And more importantly, who was still pretending not to? The media, always alert to even the slightest tremor within the royal family, responded with urgency. Headlines formed quickly, narratives built even faster. What had once been dismissed as speculation now carried credibility. Their backing transformed William's plan from a quiet internal adjustment into something far more substantial: a movement, a direction, a signal that change was not only coming, but already underway. And with that recognition came tension. Not open, not explosive, but steady and undeniable. The kind that builds slowly, tightening its grip with every passing day. Because beneath the surface of public statements and carefully measured appearances, something deeper was taking shape. A divide that could no longer be ignored. One that stretched beyond individual decisions and into the very structure of the monarchy itself. And as more pieces began to fall into place, it became increasingly clear that this was never just about support, it was about positioning, about alignment, about preparing for what was coming next. What seemed like a simple show of support quickly revealed something far more calculated: an alliance that had been building in the shadows for months. Behind closed doors, the plan wasn't just bold, it was unprecedented. A sweeping restructuring that threatened to redraw centuries-old lines of influence, placing Prince William at the center of a new royal order. What had begun as whispers now hardened into something structured, something deliberate, something that could no longer be dismissed as internal adjustment. This was not a reaction, it was a strategy. Carefully assembled, quietly refined, and then introduced with a precision that left little room for negotiation. At its core was a simple but disruptive idea: streamline the monarchy, tighten its structure, and place authority where it could act decisively. But simplicity, in a system built on tradition and hierarchy, is often the most dangerous form of change. The proposal reached deeper than anyone had expected. Roles that had once been assumed permanent were suddenly being reconsidered. Duties that had been passed down through habit rather than necessity were now under review. And within that review came something even more unsettling: a quiet consolidation of authority around William and Catherine, Princess of Wales. Not announced, not declared, but understood. The future monarchy, as outlined in these discussions, would not resemble the present one. It would be smaller, more controlled, more focused, and at its center would be a partnership that had already begun to redefine expectations. To some, it felt inevitable, a modernization long overdue. But to others, it felt like erosion, the slow dismantling of a system that had survived precisely because it resisted sudden change. Traditionalists within the palace, those who had built their influence through years of loyalty and careful positioning, began to push back. Not openly, not recklessly, but with the kind of resistance that moves through conversations, through hesitation, through subtle delays that signal discomfort without confrontation. Because challenging change is one thing. Challenging who is driving that change is something else entirely. And then came the leaks. Small at first, fragmented, easy to question, but consistent enough to form a pattern. Details about the restructuring began to surface, each one adding weight to what had once been speculation. The language used was cautious, but the implications were not. There were references to influence being rebalanced, to roles being redefined, to expectations being realigned. Words that sounded administrative on the surface, but carried consequences that extended far beyond paperwork. It was within those early revelations that another name began to surface more frequently: Queen Camilla. Not directly, not explicitly, but enough to suggest tension. Enough to raise questions. Because if influence was being consolidated, it meant that somewhere, influence was being reduced. And within a structure where presence often equals power, even a subtle shift can feel like a loss that cannot be easily recovered. Those closest to the unfolding situation began to sense it: the quiet friction, the careful recalculations, the growing awareness that this was not just a plan, but a turning point. A moment where the monarchy was being asked to choose between continuity and transformation. And as that choice began to take shape, it became increasingly difficult to ignore what lay beneath it: not just ambition, not just necessity, but consequence. Because as the blueprint of this new monarchy came into focus, it became clear someone stood to lose far more than just influence. They didn't speak publicly. They didn't need to. Inside the palace, resistance began, quietly measured, strategic, and deeply personal. And at the center of it all was a growing unease surrounding Queen Camilla's diminishing role. What had once been steady, almost unchallenged influence was now being questioned in ways that felt unfamiliar, even unsettling. Not through confrontation, not through open disagreement, but through something far more difficult to counter: absence. Invitations that didn't arrive. Consultations that happened without her presence. Decisions that moved forward without requiring her input. These were not dramatic gestures, but within the structure of the monarchy, they carried unmistakable meaning. Influence, when it begins to fade, rarely does so loudly. It recedes. Quietly. Deliberately. And those closest to it always feel it first. Reports of internal pushback began to surface, though never in a way that could be directly traced. Senior royal circles, long accustomed to operating behind layers of discretion, were now described as tense, divided, uncertain. Conversations that once flowed easily had become measured, cautious. Words were chosen carefully, positions even more so. Because this was no longer just about adapting to change, it was about deciding where to stand as that change took hold. And for many, that decision was far from simple. Camilla's position, once reinforced by proximity and familiarity, now appeared less secure within the evolving structure shaped by Prince William's vision. The restructuring, though never framed as personal, carried consequences that could not be ignored. Influence was being redistributed. Authority was being clarified. And within that process, certain roles inevitably shifted. The discomfort wasn't just political, it was deeply human. A quiet realization that what once felt permanent might no longer be guaranteed. Palace insiders described key meetings as increasingly strained. Not explosive, not chaotic, but heavy. The kind of atmosphere where every pause holds meaning, where every silence feels intentional. Senior aides, those tasked with maintaining both stability and progress, found themselves navigating a delicate divide. Loyalty pulled in one direction, long-term strategy pulled in another, and somewhere between the two, decisions had to be made carefully, quietly, but with lasting impact. At the center of this growing tension stood King Charles III, caught between forces that refused to fully align. On one side, the need to preserve continuity, to protect relationships that had been built over years. On the other, the undeniable momentum of a future that demanded change, clarity, and control. His position was not one of authority alone, it was one of balance. And maintaining that balance was becoming increasingly difficult as the divide deepened. Meanwhile, pressure on William continued to build, not publicly, not in ways that could be easily seen, but steadily. Questions emerged subtle at first, then more persistent. Was the restructuring too abrupt? Too concentrated? Too disruptive? And yet, despite the pressure, his stance did not waver. If anything, it hardened. Because what he was shaping was not simply a response to the present, it was a framework for what would come next. And frameworks, once set, are not easily undone. But while resistance simmered behind closed doors, one move would soon force everything into the open, and there would be no turning back. It wasn't just whispers anymore. The shift became visible, undeniable. Appearances changed, invitations shifted, and suddenly, the monarchy the public thought they knew began to look very different. At first, the changes were subtle enough to dismiss: a slightly altered seating arrangement, a different order of arrivals, engagements that seemed routine, yet carried a quiet rearrangement of presence. But within an institution where every detail is deliberate, even the smallest adjustment carries meaning. And those who had been watching closely began to notice that something was no longer aligning with tradition. It wasn't announced, it wasn't explained. It simply began to unfold. Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, were no longer just prominent, they were central. Their appearances increased, their roles expanded, their presence became the focal point of moments that once would have been shared across a broader circle. It wasn't just frequency. It was emphasis, the kind that signals direction, the kind that reshapes perception without needing to declare it outright. And with each appearance, that perception grew stronger that the future was no longer approaching, it was already taking form. Then came another shift, one that carried even more weight beneath the surface. Zara Tindall and Mike Tindall, once known for their distance from the core structure of royal duties, began appearing alongside key engagements. Not in a ceremonial capacity, not as observers, but as participants. Their presence added something new and unexpected reinforcement, a signal that the restructuring was not limited to internal planning, but was now being reflected in public alignment. And that alignment raised questions. Because involvement, in a system like this, is never without intention. At the same time, absences began to speak just as loudly. Certain senior figures, once consistently visible, now appeared less frequently. Not removed, not excluded, but repositioned in ways that could not be easily explained. The balance had shifted. And while the changes were presented through routine appearances, their implications reached far deeper. Because visibility, within the monarchy, is not just about presence, it is about influence. And when that visibility changes, so does the perception of power. The media, sensing the pattern as it became impossible to ignore, began to reshape its narrative. What had once been framed as speculation was now being described as transformation. Words like transition, modernization, and new era began to dominate headlines, each one reinforcing the idea that something fundamental was unfolding. Yet even within that framing, uncertainty remained, because change, especially within an institution built on continuity, does not arrive without resistance. And the more visible it becomes, the more questions it invites. Public reaction followed a similar divide. Some saw clarity, a necessary evolution that aligned the monarchy with a changing world. Others saw disruption, a departure from stability that felt too sudden, too concentrated. Support and concern existed side by side, each growing as the changes became harder to overlook. And beneath that reaction, a deeper tension continued to build, quiet, persistent, waiting for something that would bring it fully into view. Because just as the world began to adjust to this new reality, just as the shifting roles and redefined presence began to settle into place, there was a growing sense that this was not the full story. That something more was still hidden beneath the surface, something that had yet to be revealed. And when that moment came, it wouldn't simply confirm what had already been seen, it would change how everything was understood. And just as the world began to grasp the scale of this transformation, one final revelation threatened to redefine everything the monarchy stood for. What was once managed behind palace doors could no longer be contained. The divide wasn't just strategic, it was deeply personal, cutting through the very heart of the royal family. The strain had been building quietly, layered beneath protocol, hidden behind routine, softened by carefully chosen words. But now, it surfaced in ways that could no longer be disguised. Conversations grew shorter, responses more measured. The unspoken began to outweigh the spoken. And within that silence, relationships that had once appeared unshakable began to show signs of fracture. Not sudden, not explosive, but steady, undeniable. The kind of strain that doesn't need to be seen to be felt. At the center of it all stood Prince William, no longer just navigating a plan, but defending it. The pressure surrounding him had intensified, not through open opposition, but through expectation. Every decision now carried weight beyond its immediate impact. Every move was observed, interpreted, questioned. And yet, despite that pressure, his stance remained firm. Not rigid, but resolved. Because what he was shaping was no longer just a response to current challenges, it was a commitment to a direction he believed the monarchy could not avoid. Beside him, Catherine, Princess of Wales, became something more than a partner. She became the stabilizing force within a system that was beginning to shift under its own weight. Her role was not defined by authority, but by presence. A quiet strength that held the center when everything else seemed to pull apart. Where William carried the responsibility of action, she carried the balance of continuity. And together, they formed something that extended beyond strategy, a sense of direction that others could either follow or resist, but not ignore. The tension, however, was not limited to them. It stretched across the family, touching relationships that had once existed without question. Reports began to surface of strained interactions, of distance where there had once been ease. Not every disagreement was visible, not every divide openly acknowledged, but the pattern was clear enough to unsettle those who understood how the monarchy functioned. Because unity, within this institution, is not just symbolic, it is foundational. And when that unity begins to shift, even slightly, the consequences can be far-reaching. It was in this atmosphere that Zara Tindall's loyalty took on new meaning. What had once been seen as support now felt like alignment. A choice that extended beyond family ties into something more defined, more intentional. And that choice, quiet as it may have seemed, carried weight. Because in a moment where neutrality had become increasingly difficult, her position signaled that the divide was no longer abstract, it was real, and it was growing. Questions began to surface, not just within the palace, but beyond it. What would this mean for the long-term unity of the monarchy? Could a system built on tradition withstand a transformation that challenged its internal balance? And perhaps most pressing of all, was this division something that could be repaired, or had it already reached a point where return was no longer possible? Because as tension reached its peak, as relationships adjusted under pressure and loyalties became more defined, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was not simply a moment of conflict. It was a moment of change. A turning point that would shape not just the present, but everything that followed. But even as tensions reached their peak, the real question remained, was this division a breaking point? Or the beginning of something entirely new? For generations, the monarchy has survived by adapting. But this was something else. A transformation not just of structure, but of identity itself. What Prince William was shaping no longer resembled the slow, cautious evolution that had defined the institution for decades. This was sharper, more deliberate. A vision that did not wait for time to adjust, but instead demanded that the system adjust to it. At its core was a simple but uncompromising principle: control must be clear, roles must be defined, and the monarchy must function with precision rather than tradition alone. It was not about abandoning the past, it was about refusing to be bound by it. The idea of a smaller, more focused monarchy began to take hold within this framework. Fewer working royals, tighter coordination, responsibilities that were no longer spread thin across a wide network, but concentrated where they could be managed effectively. To some, it felt efficient. To others, it felt restrictive, because reducing complexity also meant reducing space for influence, for presence, for the kind of visibility that had long been tied to status within the royal structure. And in a system where presence often defines relevance, that shift carried consequences that extended far beyond logistics. At the same time, there was a clear emphasis on something that could not be ignored: public trust. Not as a vague ideal, but as a measurable priority. Every decision, every appearance, every adjustment seemed to move toward a single goal: clarity. A monarchy that the public could understand, follow, and believe in. And that required something the institution had not always embraced: simplicity. A structure that made sense not just internally, but externally. A system that could justify itself without relying solely on history. Within that vision, Catherine, Princess of Wales, was no longer simply part of the future, she was central to it. Her role had evolved beyond support into something more foundational. A presence that balanced authority with approachability, continuity with change. Where William carried the force of direction, she embodied its stability. And together, they represented a model that felt both modern and familiar. A combination that allowed the transition to move forward without completely severing its connection to the past. Alongside them, the presence of Zara Tindall and Mike Tindall introduced something entirely new: a different kind of support system. Less formal, less bound by expectation, yet undeniably aligned. Their involvement suggested that the future monarchy would not rely solely on tradition to sustain itself, but would instead draw strength from relationships that felt grounded, relatable, and strategically placed. It was a subtle shift, but one that carried significant meaning. Because beneath all of this, one truth continued to surface: the monarchy was not evolving by choice alone. It was responding to pressure, to expectation, to a world that no longer accepted complexity without purpose. And within that response, the line between necessity and ambition became increasingly blurred. Was this transformation being driven by survival, or by a desire to redefine what survival looked like? And as this new vision began to take shape, one final truth emerged: this wasn't just about survival. It was about legacy. In the end, it was never just about a plan. It was about what would remain when the dust settled, who would lead, who would follow, and who would be left behind. What had unfolded within those guarded walls was no longer a temporary adjustment or a response to immediate pressure. It had become something far more permanent, a redefinition of how the monarchy would exist moving forward. The implications stretched far beyond the present moment, reaching into a future that was still taking shape but already beginning to solidify. Because once a structure is altered at its core, it does not simply return to what it was. It evolves, whether by design or by consequence. And this evolution carried weight that could not be ignored. At the center of that shift stood Prince William, no longer navigating possibility, but embodying certainty. His leadership, once seen as emerging, now felt established. Not declared, not formally recognized, but understood through action. Through consistency. Through a willingness to hold direction even when resistance grew louder beneath the surface. This was no longer about preparing for the future, it was about defining it. And in doing so, he had already begun to shape the role that awaited him, long before it would officially become his. Beside him, Catherine, Princess of Wales's influence had deepened in ways that extended beyond visibility. It was not simply that she was present more often, or that her role had expanded. It was that she had become a point of connection, a figure through whom the public could interpret change without feeling disconnected from tradition. Trust, once carefully maintained, was now being actively reinforced. And within a system that depends on perception as much as structure, that trust became one of the most valuable forces shaping its future. At the same time, the presence of Zara Tindall and Mike Tindall had quietly redefined their place within the royal narrative. No longer observers at the edge, they had become part of the alignment that supported this transformation. Their involvement, once unexpected, now felt integrated, an example of how the monarchy could draw strength from those who understood it without being confined by its traditional boundaries. And in that shift, their role became more than supportive. It became symbolic of a broader change in how influence could be expressed. But with every rise, there was an inevitable decline. Traditional power structures, long sustained by familiarity and precedent, began to fade not abruptly, not dramatically, but steadily. Influence that had once been assumed now had to be justified. Presence that had once been guaranteed now had to be earned. And within that recalibration, the monarchy revealed something essential about itself. It was not immune to change. It was defined by how it managed it. What remained then was not certainty, but direction. A monarchy stepping into a new chapter without fully knowing how it would be received, but moving forward nonetheless. The balance between continuity and transformation had shifted, and with it came both opportunity and risk. Because every decision made in this moment would echo beyond it, shaping not just perception, but legacy. And legacy, within the House of Windsor, is never a quiet thing. It is built, tested, and remembered. Because in the House of Windsor, change is never just change, it is a reckoning. One that echoes far beyond the palace walls and into history itself. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.